agenda. So with that in mind, here's what we'll be covering today on the afternoon agenda. New figures reveal how dozens of child sex offences are committed on Facebook apps every month in the UK. A leading charity wants urgent action. Plus, are COVID cases set to plummet? After a recent rise in infections, the rate appears to have slowed down and may be starting to drop in England. And it may not be on the agenda of traditional news outlets, but we need to talk about artificial intelligence. I'm asking, is it something we should fear? I have a huge host of guests lined up. That's the agenda for the next hour, but what's on yours? Email me, gbnews@gbnews.uk, or of course, you can tweet me at gbnews. But first, it's time for the news headlines.
Thanks, Alex. Your GB News at 4 o'clock. Teachers, nurses and police are among the public sector workers in line for a pay rise next year. The Chancellor is due to announce the change for millions of workers in tomorrow's budget. It comes after Rishi Sunak paused public sector pay increases after heavy borrowing during the pandemic. However, Labour's shadow child poverty minister, Wes Streeting, told GB News that the current budget announcements, including the national minimum wage increase, don't go far enough.
The minimum wage increase doesn't go anywhere near far enough to compensating people for those losses. In fact, we calculated that even when you take into account the minimum wage increase, once you've factored in the universal credit cut, once you've factored in the national insurance hike, people end up being still about £800 a year worse off. And by definition, these are people on some of the lowest incomes when they go out to work.
Meanwhile, Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle has criticised the government, saying the number of pre-budget press briefings is unacceptable.
But once again, this House will not be taken for granted. It is not right for everybody to be briefed. It's not more important to go on the news in the morning. It's more important to come here. Let's get this message across. These are the elected members that represents this United Kingdom.
Now, Scotland's First Minister has said there won't be any immediate changes to the country's COVID regulations. Updating MSPs on the latest COVID situation at Holyrood, the First Minister said that while the situation has greatly improved since August, it remains fragile as Scotland heads into the winter period. The UN, though, has warned the world is on track for a climate catastrophe and that plans to cut emissions still fall far short of what's needed. The organisation's Environment Programme said even with plans and pledges from countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the next decade, the world faces global warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. The former Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson faces a 30-day ban from Parliament for breaking lobbying rules. That's after an investigation by the Parliamentary Committee on Standards into Paterson's lobbying for two companies he was a consultant for. The committee say they found an egregious case of paid advocacy. The former Cabinet Minister rejects the findings. Sussex police say they're investigating 7 cases of women being injected or so-called spiked on nights out. The reports have all come from Brighton and Eastbourne in the last week. Detectives have said they want to assure members of the public and will increase their patrols in the affected areas. The mother of 2 murdered sisters, Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman, has dismissed an apology from the Metropolitan Police. The force apologised to the family for their initial response to reports the girls were missing, saying it had been below the standard it should have achieved. The sisters were found dead in a North London park in June last year. Daniel Hussain will be sentenced for the double murder this week. Now, activists have scaled a government building in London to protest for animal rights and climate change. A group from Animal Rebellion, that's an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion, climbed the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs at 6 a.m. They say they plan to stay there indefinitely. And James, speaking from the side of the building, told GB News the government's priorities are all wrong.
UK government is being a public nuisance by spending £1.5 billion of taxpayer money on subsidies for the meat and dairy industry. That's an industry that is ultimately killing the planet and killing billions of animals. In the meantime, it's spending 150 million, that's 10% of that, on planting trees and similarly on alternative proteins. It goes to show like the government's priorities in terms of propping up unsustainable and unprofitable industries over what's ultimately better for the public and for the planet.
Sport and former Rangers manager Walter Smith has died at the age of 73. He led Rangers to 10 wins in top titles, as well as to the UEFA Cup final in 2008 in his career. He also managed the Scottish national team and Everton. The club chairman, Douglas Park, said that Walter will be sorely missed by all of us at Rangers. Her Majesty the Queen has carried out her first official engagement since her overnight stay in hospital last week. She appeared on a screen via a video link from Windsor Castle, where she's in residence, during a virtual audience with the ambassador from the Republic of Korea. You're up to date. Now back to the afternoon agenda.
Good afternoon. You're watching the Afternoon Agenda, and today we need to talk about artificial intelligence. If, like me, the peak of your IT ability begins and ends with Windows 98, and even a basic formula on a spreadsheet is cause for despair, well, you've probably allowed the stupefyingly rapid pace of technological advancements to wash over you and are equivalent to Y2K technological flotsam and jetsam. Yes, you may now use Face ID to unlock your phone, ask your in-car sat-nav to figure out your journey rather than leaf through the pages of Ordnance Survey, and get peeved trying to prove to Google you aren't a robot by selecting pixelated boxes of traffic lights. But the latter may be an eerie harbinger of what lies ahead, because artificial intelligence is on the rampage, and there is a serious arms race taking place around the world which will unleash a largely unregulated, untested, and potentially limitless technology upon us all. Sci-fi films and robot movies almost always explore the concept that automatons may one day escape the grip of human control, evolve free will, and turn against us. But actually, the reality might be quite the opposite. You see, the risk of AI is that however clever it gets, however much machine learning can outpace the human brain with processing speeds, get this, 10 million times faster, the gulf between human reasoning and computer logic is still enormous. A computer can win a game of chess once all the potential rules and moves are programmed in, calculating at split-second speeds an infinite number of outcomes. But the nuances of rational thought can be rather lost on our pre-programmed friend, leading to petty frustrations or catastrophic disasters. Ask artificial intelligence to build a machine to get between point A and B in the fastest time possible. And rather than develop a flying craft to speed through the skies at a record pace, it could simply decide to forge a gigantic tower and topple across the gap, indeed joining the 2 points at the speed of gravity, yet causing quite a lot of mess in the process. AI will do exactly as you say, without limitation, unless you, the human, can foresee all the potential interpretations and ensure unwanted ones are coded out. See, this is potentially the real risk of AI, especially in a military setting, where the response times of machine learning far outstrip considered reason, essential in warfare to allow for de-escalation and avert disaster. AI is now being applied everywhere in ways most mortal beings struggle to comprehend. It is an unprecedented and potent technology, fast being harnessed by a tiny few, without regulation or restriction. It's being applied to healthcare, with artificial intelligence able to crunch an individual's biometric data to accurately predict future health issues and precisely target bespoke treatment in truly incredible advancements. It has even been used to develop the first AI-driven synthetic antibiotic, perfectly rendered to attack unwanted microbes. Yet the same capability could also allow a hostile actor to create both an artificial disease and its antidote to unleash global disaster. COVID is surely a deafening klaxon on how easily things can go terribly wrong. When driverless cars have a glitch, usually down to an unpredicted factor not anticipated during the technology's development, the outcome could be fatal. In one such experiment, an AI vehicle programmed for use on motorways ploughed straight into the side of a lorry in an urban street, as it was only able to recognise an HGV from behind and calculated the side view of the truck to instead be a bridge it could pass under. The idea that AI could therefore rise up and take over the world is evidently rather fanciful, well, at least for now. Yet we are already seeing how algorithms are having a hugely harmful impact on societies when interwoven with human emotional intelligence and complex social structures. Accusations today abound that Facebook prioritises and hyper-concentrates extreme and polarising content that is messing with people's minds. As the world tools up for a major arms race to develop this incredible, godlike technology at an astonishing speed, how do we regulate something that can wield so much power and outstrip mortal competencies? Who are the AI puppeteers? Do they know what they're messing with? And are their intentions pure? Far from the adorable domestic robot in the Jetsons, AI has the potential to unburden humanity from laborious calculations and decisions bound by human limitation. But is enthusiastically gifting our agency to a machine really a good thing? Or are we headed for a dystopian disaster? Today, we really need to talk about AI. So we're talking about artificial intelligence, and earlier this month, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak made this pledge at the Conservative Party conference on more artificial intelligence apprenticeships for young people here in the UK.
Once the stuff of science fiction, now it's reality, and we are a global leader. The steam engine kicked off the Industrial Revolution. Computers delivered automation. The internet brought information exchange. And as the latest general-purpose technology, AI has the potential to transform whole economies and societies. If artificial intelligence were to contribute just the average productivity increase of those three technologies, that will be worth around £200 billion a year to our economy. And so today, I'm announcing that we will create 2,000 elite AI scholarships for disadvantaged young people and double the number of Turing AI world-leading research fellows, helping to ensure that the most exciting industries and opportunities are open to all parts of our society.
Well, it all sounds like very positive stuff, doesn't it? But what about the risk that comes with artificial intelligence, especially with the international arms race to develop it? Joining me now is former Senior Military Intelligence Officer Philip Ingram, MBE. Philip, fantastic to have you on the show. So where are we, broadly speaking, globally, when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence in things like defence?
Well, artificial intelligence, and we're mixing up our terminologies here. The majority of what's out there that people describe as artificial intelligence is really just machine learning. And that's a machine studying its computer algorithms to make the programs improve through experience. Whereas artificial intelligence is taking that one step further and bringing it to a level of where you'd expect more human judgment calls to be brought in. But artificial intelligence and machine learning as a subset of it is a tool that's there to help human decision making with the vast amounts of information that come to us through all of the computer systems that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, described whenever he was making his announcement. That those volumes of data are so big that no one human being or even a team of human beings can accurately process them in a way to make some sense out of them. And this is where the machine learning and artificial intelligence will help, but there will always be a human being in the loop where there are critical decisions to be made. This opens up the debate as to whether advertising that's being pushed forward or messaging that's been put pushed forward on social media platforms is critical or not.
But in that respect, in terms of usage in conflict situations, is there not a risk that comes with creating a technology with arguably boundless competence, able to process things at up to 10 million times the speed of the human brain, but yet still bound to human fallibility? You know, if you're in a submarine and all of a sudden your computer says to you, there's a threat coming your way, you must press this button to save the Earth, and you press it and the machine's got it wrong. I mean, that might be a very simplistic view, but you know, is there a risk that comes with developing this technology that overrides things like deliberation and constructive debate and therefore trying to de-escalate situations?
There is, if you rely on machine learning or artificial intelligence to make the decisions, but we don't. We rely on human beings. There's been a version of machine learning around for many, many years in the military and in intelligence. And, certainly, a lot of the time whenever I was fed information that came through and it came in, you make a judgment call on something and you go, that may not be completely right. And we had what was soak time. And I go away and make a cup of tea and come back again. And as I finished the cup of tea, invariably the information would have changed a little bit as the assessments changed or more information came in. And that sort of process is in place. We have to make sure that we understand the algorithms and they're put together. The base data is critical, especially when it comes to learning. And this is where the biggest threats come in, because if your enemy, if a criminal organization or an enemy organization can get in and mess around with the base data that you've got, then you've got garbage in, garbage out, and they're stimulating more garbage out. So there are a lot of issues that come out of this. And it's the technology of today and of the future, and something we have to embrace.
Yeah, I mean, talking about it being the technology of today and the future, sources in the Pentagon have expressed deep concern about the pace of progress in China, because the CCP have put development of artificial intelligence right at the heart of their strategy for China over coming decades. Is that something we should be worried about, or can we be reassured that, the people working in this sector creating these incredible innovative technologies that bypass the limitations of human thought processes are going to use these things for good?
No, we have to be extremely worried, especially about China's advancement in anything to do with the development of technology. We look at the way that China's been using its facial recognition technology combined with machine learning to identify members of the Uyghur population so that they can then put them into their, what they euphemistically call retraining camps. That is where we can see these tools being used for bad effect. And China can turn around and throw resources at stuff from a national perspective that we can't do in the West, because our governments would far rather invest in our health services, our social care, and everything else, and haven't got the ability to throw the sorts of money that China can do and the sorts of effort that China can do at these sorts of things. So it's an area that we need to be very, very concerned about.
So, I mean, in fact, the announcement by the Chancellor that he wants to see a huge investment in Britain in AI to make the UK a leader globally in this sector must be music to your ears.
Well, it is, and traditionally the UK has been, the world's inventor. If you look at all of the things that we've invented over the years, most of the technologies that exist have come from British inventors. From the LED light invented by a defense organization, through to computers, through to the code breaking devices that were developed through the Second World War, and so much more. And therefore, it's right and proper that the UK tries to retain this lead and invest in young people so that we can get our technologists of the future with the right level of training so we can stay on top of things.
I mean, one area in which China seems to be particularly focused is in areas such as facial recognition and things that could be used perhaps for subterfuge, for spying on people, for storing databases and being able to target certain sections of society. Is that something that, ordinary people need to be mindful about as they go about their daily business? If they've downloaded TikTok, for example, that at one point came under fire by President Trump for potentially being a vehicle through which China can store biometric information?
People do need to be very cognizant of what I class as their digital exposure. Everyone understands their physical exposure. They know when to close the front door. You know when to close the curtains in your house. But people will do things digitally on social media platforms without understanding the terms and conditions that they've clicked and agreed to. And it's not just China in this. China with TikTok, that is a massive intelligence gathering platform, and they use it to influence people. Facebook, as we've seen in the press, which is an American company, is a platform that's used to influence people. I've written a blog on Pokemon Go and the potential that was being used to gather information on behalf of government agencies, and that's a US company that's in there. But China specifically, any apps, platforms that come out of China and Russia, I would say, where there's Russian links in there, will have a massive state intelligence gathering capability behind it.
Philip, I could talk to you about this all day. This is so fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on and kicking off this programme today. And let's get you back on soon to continue this conversation, because there's so much more we could cover. Wonderful stuff. Philip Ingram, MBE. And there you are. If you're on TikTok, perhaps think twice, says she who has her mug all over the television. Well, we'll be continuing this conversation throughout the show, and I really want to know what you think. Email me, gbviews@gbnews. You can also tweet me, of course, @gbnews. And there's a poll up right now asking, should we fear artificial intelligence? Have a listen to some of the interviews today as we cover this topic in as much depth as time will allow, and then cast your vote so I get to know what you, the nation, really thinks. After the break, are COVID cases set to plunge? After a recent surge, there are signs that the rate of infections have slowed down. First, it's the weather forecast.
Hello, an unsettled few days ahead across the UK. Some heavy rain to come over the next couple of days. Windy for all of us, but it is staying pretty mild out there. Let's take a look at the pressure pattern. You can see very tightly packed isobars bringing the winds from the southwest, so from a mild direction. But as we go through Wednesday and Thursday, it's this weather front that we're keeping close eyes on. That's going to bring some heavy rain, and we've got weather warnings in place. That rain is currently situated across parts of Scotland, and that's going to gradually trickle its way southwards as we go through Tuesday evening and overnight, becoming quite persistent then across parts of northwest England into southwest Scotland. A rain warning in force here. But these are your overnight temperatures as we start Wednesday morning. These are more typical of what we should be seeing by daytime at this stage in October. So some heavy rain through the morning going to be pushing its way in. Persistent as well, some difficult travelling conditions and the risk of some flooding as that rain starts to accumulate through the day. To the south of it, it's very mild, a few breaks in the cloud to the east of the Pennines, across parts of southeast England as well. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud around, but highs of 18 degrees, 64 Fahrenheit, exceptionally high for this time of year. A few showers also coming in across western Scotland. Now that rain continues to track its way slowly south and eastwards as we go through Wednesday night, becoming more persistent across Wales then through Thursday. So we have a rain warning developing here through the day. As I say, we could see a large amount of rain piling up over the next few days. Still very mild though as we start Thursday morning, 12 to 14 degrees, but a little bit cooler up towards the northwest where we see some clearer skies. Then through Thursday, it's a case of spot the difference. Further wet weather to come across these western areas, only slowly making its progress eastwards through the day. Some brighter spells elsewhere and a few showers. Staying unsettled then as we look towards the weekend. Temperatures coming down on Saturday. Bye-bye.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Over the past couple of weeks, COVID cases have been rising, and health professionals have been among those calling for the dreaded Plan B measures to be introduced as pressure mounts on the NHS. But the recent rise in infections appears to have slowed down and is starting to drop in England. This comes as most recent modelling done for the government suggests cases and deaths could soon start to fall dramatically. So are cases presumably in retreat? Is there still the need to introduce Plan B? Well, joining me now to discuss all of this is the Chair of Primary Care and Public Health at Imperial College, London Professor Azeem Majid. Azeem, fantastic to have you on. Are you reassured or encouraged by these signs that perhaps the whichever wave we're on now, X wave, might have had its day?
Hello, Alex. There's some positive news over the past week. Cases have fallen across the UK by about 20,000, from 56,000 to 36,000 yesterday. But it's still a very high number. And since July, we have seen cases vary between 30,000 and 50,000 a day, typically over that period. So there's some good news, but there's a long way to go yet. And we're not yet fully into winter, where we might expect more pressure on infection numbers.
Do we yet wholly understand what sort of triggers the rise and fall of these various waves? Is it entirely down to government intervention and putting certain measures in place? Because, of course, now a lot of us are vaccinated, but we don't have not even half as many of the restrictions that perhaps are being used still on the continent.
Yeah, it's more difficult now to predict the future because when the pandemic first started, no one was immune. So it's very easy to kind of predict, patterns of infection or easy it is now. But now, when we've got people vaccinated, people who had previous infections, it's much harder to predict how they will react to exposure to the virus, and so it is hard to predict the future. I think one thing, though, is very clear, is the number of cases is very sensitive to vaccination coverage in the population. So if vaccination coverage is a bit higher than we expect, that has a big impact on the number of cases and pushing it down. If it's a bit lower than we expect, that has a big impact the other way. Case numbers will increase. So I think the key for the next few months is really getting vaccination coverage to a very high level of the population. So at the moment, we've got about 1 in 10 adults across the UK who've not been vaccinated, about 5 million people. So we have got a large number of people who've never been vaccinated at all. So the key really, we all want to avoid additional measures like lockdowns, etc. But the key to that really is pushing vaccination rates up to a high level and really targeting the group that's not been vaccinated at all so far, as well as boosters and other vaccines for children and so on as we move forwards.
I mean, certainly we live in unprecedented times, and so sort of the modelling of how we address this pandemic is almost having to be made up as we go along. Has the vaccination programme been as successful as people hoped? Because we're already talking about things like third vaccinations and booster jabs for people, and looking ahead at Israel, where they've done a lot of third jabs, they are still having problems there with fatalities from COVID-19. Are vaccinations going to be the way out of this, do you think?
In the long term, that is the only way out of this pandemic. And so the vaccines are working well. So if we look at death rates now, for example, we're getting about 100 or so deaths a day, whereas back in January, we were getting over 1,000 a day for a similar number of cases. So deaths have been suppressed about 10% of what we might have expected without vaccines. And we're seeing similar effects on hospital admissions as well. They are working. There is evidence, though, the vaccine protection can weaken over time. So after 5 or 6 months, it can weaken, which is why we've not got these boosters coming into place. The good news is for Israel and elsewhere is that the boosters do work very well. And so a third dose of vaccine does really boost your immunity a lot and really helps in suppressing your risk of infection and serious illness.
And do we think that, if we go through round 3 of vaccinations, that we can finally draw a line underneath COVID? Or are we looking at having to have seasonal vaccinations ad infinitum, do you think?
So we need more data. So after the third vaccine's been given this winter, we'll need to check people for their risk of infection, check their immune levels in research studies. And by doing that, we can then see if their immunity wanes over time. It may be the case, though, that this virus becomes like the flu virus, where we need annual boosters every year to keep our immunity up. So it could be that this is a feature of our life going forwards. But we need more research to see if the third injection actually protects you more than just 2 doses. But it may be the case that in the longer term, it becomes like flu, where many people need regular annual boosters to protect them.
If you're going to anticipate the sort of winter we may now be facing, I mean, if COVID cases are suddenly on a downward trajectory, which we can keep our fingers crossed and hope that they are, if we now see a season of flu come in and a particularly virulent strain of the flu, do you think there will be need for the government to go down the route of social distancing, of compulsory mask wearing, of calls to work from home again, or do you think we're still quite a long way off that?
I think we are still at a level where we've got a high number of cases across the UK. So I think there are some things we could do which wouldn't have much damage to the economy, like, for example, wearing face masks. Doesn't really impact the economy in any great way. So that's something that we could do, which would help reduce not just this virus, but also flu virus rates as well. So I think that I would encourage. I think working from home, could be encouraged as well where it's possible, not for everyone. But I think other measures like lockdowns, I think those can be avoided for now, because I think rates of infection are not that higher. But I think some things are, should be encouraged, like wearing face masks in crowded indoor spaces or where you're exposed to other people.
Has anything changed about the profile of those people now going into hospital? I mean, are they largely unvaccinated people, or are these vaccinated people perhaps with, complex health portfolios and comorbidities? Or has the virus changed in a way that it's targeting and attacking new demographics in society?
So when we compare the cases being admitted, if you look at the rates of admission, they're much higher amongst people who have not been vaccinated, as you might expect, because the vaccines do protect against serious illness. But because many people have now been vaccinated, about 90% of adults in the UK, it does mean that a lot of cases are occurring amongst people who have been vaccinated. So there's a case vaccines protect, but they're not, entirely protective. And so some people vaccinated will still get infection, unfortunately. And of those people, some will have a serious illness. But they do protect, as I mentioned earlier on, deaths are now around 10% of what we might expect without vaccines.
Professor Azim Majid, thank you so much for coming on today and giving us your wisdom and your insight into the ongoing pandemic. We all wish it was over, don't we? Coming up, a surge in knife crime has led one mother to take a stand and demand bleed control kits be rolled out across the country. We'll be hearing from her after the break, but first, here's a roundup of the news headlines.
Yes, I'm Polly Middlehurst, and here are the latest news headlines. Teachers, nurses and police are among the public sector workers in line for a pay rise next year. The Chancellor's due to announce the change for millions of workers in tomorrow's budget. It comes after Rishi Sunak paused public sector pay increases after heavy borrowing during the pandemic.
But once again, this House will not be taken for granted. It is not right for everybody to be briefed. It's not more important to go on the news in the morning. It's more important to come here. Let's get this message across. These are the elected members that represents this United Kingdom.
Sussex police say they're investigating 7 cases of women being injected or spiked on nights out. The reports have all come from Brighton and Eastbourne in the last week. Detectives said they want to reassure members of the public and will increase their patrols in the affected areas. The UN has warned the world is on track for a climate catastrophe and that plans to cut emissions still fall far short of what's needed. The organisation's environment programme said even with plans and pledges from countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the next decade, the world still faces global warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. Scotland's First Minister has said there won't be any immediate changes to the country's COVID regulations. Updating MSPs on the latest COVID situation at Holyrood, the First Minister said that while the situation has greatly improved since August, it remains fragile as Scotland heads into the winter period. And Her Majesty the Queen has carried out her first official engagement a week after her overnight stay in hospital. She appeared on a screen via video link from Windsor Castle, where she's in residence, during a virtual audience with the ambassador from the Republic of Korea. You're up to date. I'm back, top of the hour.
you wonderful lot have already been sending me lots of your views on our main talking point today. Should we be afraid of artificial intelligence? Scott says, we should not be afraid of AI. Be afraid of the people behind it. And Gary says, yes, because the algorithms used to denote artificial intelligence are no substitutes for human intelligence and experience. Matt says, no. It may be the only thing to correct this polarised society with a fresh mind, pure of logic or the bonus side of it. Curtis says, we should be afraid of what governments will do with AI. Surely that is now a demonstrable fact. We have nothing to fear except the abuse of technology by politicians. We also have a poll up on Twitter right now asking, should we be afraid of artificial intelligence? Currently, 67% of you say, yes, we should. But it's still early days to carry on listening to this programme, and head over to our Twitter poll and cast your vote as you listen to all the sides of the argument. We're going to be continuing this discussion, so keep your messages coming in. Email gbviews@gbnews or tweet us at GBNews. Now, with another surge in knife crime and authorities warning of a fresh wave of terror attacks, a Birmingham mother whose own son was killed in a stabbing has told GB News bleed control kits are urgently needed across the country. Lynn Baird has fought a one-woman campaign to have the packs of heavy-duty bandages and tourniquets installed at key locations in towns and cities. So far, 2,000 kits have been distributed and have already been instrumental in saving the lives of 2 people stabbed recently in Birmingham and London. Our Home and Security editor Mark White reports from Birmingham.
Daniel went out for a night. There was some kind of altercation in the pub. It was nothing to do with him at all, and he was stabbed, and I didn't see him again.
In the 4 years since her son was stabbed and killed, Lynn Baird has fought a relentless campaign to do something positive in Daniel's memory. She is a remarkable woman who came up with the simple but highly effective idea for these specialist bleed control kits to help stem catastrophic blood loss long enough for expert help to arrive.
It's really got everything you would need. This tourniquet, obviously, I mean, for shutting off the extremities if you've got a big, serious arterial bleed.
Yep, military grade. Trauma bandage, that's for severe bleeding, you know, and practically foolproof to use as well.
Lynn believes that a simple bleed kit could have saved her own son.
There was no time. If there had been one of these kits in the pub and it had been used, we might have a different story now.
You're convinced of that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what made me carry on with this campaign.
With no end in sight to the epidemic of violent crime in many of our towns and cities, bleed control kits are now being rolled out more widely. More than 2,000 so far, with demand growing by the day. The Midlands Air Ambulance attend an average of 4 serious stabbings and shootings a week, and many more incidents where catastrophic blood loss is a key concern. Without a doubt, the Midlands Air Ambulance offers the very best critical care outside of the hospital environment, and they can get a patient to hospital in a fraction of a time it takes a land ambulance to do that. But there's no point in them even attending if a patient bleeds out before they arrive. More than 60% of call-outs for the air ambulance are trauma-related, where severe blood loss is common.
If someone has a cardiac arrest in the street, a defibrillator gets there and can make the difference in 30 seconds. Yet if somebody has a catastrophic bleed, where do you get the equipment that's going to save that life? So things like the bleed control kits, like the citizen aid advice that's available, and like the first aid training that's out there, those things together will save lives, and the interventions available in this kit will absolutely stop a catastrophic hemorrhage in the right place in the right time.
The murder of Sir David Amos has highlighted the continuing threat from terrorism, with authorities warning of the possibility of a fresh wave of attacks. Senior trauma specialists say bleed control kits, coupled with increased first aid training programmes, can help arm the public to better respond and help those caught up in an attack, where it can often be some time before medical help can reach them.
These kits are very, very useful, and it's worth saying that in particular high-risk areas like London, for example, Safeguard has worked very closely with the Metropolitan Police, with the local authorities, and there are at strategic locations multiple bleed kits stored around for exactly this reason. In that when you have not just one person, but several people, all with major hemorrhage, exactly the same principle applies, and that major hemorrhage needs to be controlled. It needs to be controlled very quickly.
The Bull's Head in Birmingham is one of the city's oldest and best known pubs. It led the way in placing bleed kits behind the bar, and now the whole of the Davenport's brewery chain has followed suit.
So all staff are trained, bar staff, floor staff, management, all of them are trained on how to use it. Just in case it was an instant thing that happened, anyone can apply it. Saves obviously wasting time, which is what that kit's for really, isn't it?
In recent weeks, the bleed control kits have been instrumental in saving the lives of 2 people who were stabbed in Birmingham and London.
I think it's absolutely wonderful that lives have been saved, which I said would happen at the beginning, and I'd just like to see these kits go all across the UK.
Nothing can ever really diminish the loss Lynn feels every day, but there is at least some comfort in the knowledge that lives are being saved in Daniel's memory. Mark White, GB News, Birmingham.
New figures which show how dozens of child sex offences are committed on Facebook apps every month in the UK, coming up next. First, let's have a look at the weather forecast.
Hello, an unsettled few days ahead across the UK. Some heavy rain to come over the next couple of days. Windy for all of us, but it is staying pretty mild out there. Let's take a look at the pressure pattern. You can see very tightly packed isobars bringing the winds from the southwest, so from a mild direction. But as we go through Wednesday and Thursday, it's this weather front that we're keeping close eyes on. That's going to bring some heavy rain, and we've got weather warnings in place. That rain is currently situated across parts of Scotland, and that's going to gradually trickle its way southwards as we go through Tuesday evening and overnight, becoming quite persistent then across parts of northwest England into southwest Scotland. A rain warning in force here. But these are your overnight temperatures as we start Wednesday morning. These are more typical of what we should be seeing by daytime at this stage in October. So some heavy rain through the morning going to be pushing its way in. Persistent as well, some difficult travelling conditions and the risk of some flooding as that rain starts to accumulate through the day. To the south of it, it's very mild, a few breaks in the cloud to the east of the Pennines, across parts of southeast England as well. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud around, but highs of 18 degrees, 64 Fahrenheit, exceptionally high for this time of year. A few showers also coming in across western Scotland. Now that rain continues to track its way slowly south and eastwards as we go through Wednesday night, becoming more persistent across Wales then through Thursday. So we have a rain warning developing here through the day. As I say, we could see a large amount of rain piling up over the next few days. Still very mild though as we start Thursday morning, 12 to 14 degrees, but a little bit cooler up towards the northwest where we see some clearer skies. Then through Thursday, it's a case of spot the difference. Further wet weather to come across these western areas, only slowly making its progress eastwards through the day. Some brighter spells elsewhere and a few showers. Staying unsettled then as we look towards the weekend. Temperatures coming down on Saturday. Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
And we're hosting a show right here on GB News, 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, called To The Point.
We're going to be talking about all the big issues that matter to you at home in Britain.
Absolutely, whether it's holding politicians to account, discussing what's taking place in the Channel, banging on about law and order, we're not afraid to do the absolute lot of it.
Yes, and if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we'll be saying it.
Make sure you're here 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
Facebook and how it protects its users is again under scrutiny. A UK charity has discovered that police in the UK recorded 5,120 child grooming crimes on apps owned by the company since 2017. According to the research, which was published by children's charity, the NSPCC, 53% of all online grooming crimes took place on Facebook platforms, including Instagram and WhatsApp, amounting to 24 incidents per week. Andy Burrows, the head of Child Safety Online Policy for the NSPCC, joins me now. Andy, it's probably not surprising, these statistics, but incredibly worrying.
Incredibly worrying. And I think what it really shows is that in the 4 years since we saw new grooming offences come onto the charge sheet, the scale and complexity of online sexual abuse against children has continued to increase. And as those figures have continued to increase, then, it's the same old story that we're not seeing the tech giants do enough. When we dig into these figures in a bit more detail, what we can see that's particularly concerning is Instagram, and both the number of offences and the proportion of overall offences that are taking place on Instagram has continued to surge during the last 4 years, which really underlines that on the Facebook service, which is used most frequently by children, there's a really significant problem that Facebook are really failing to get to grips with.
I mean, have big tech essentially created a perfect storm here? Because it sort of set in motion this trend of, especially girls, but not always girls, but pouting for the camera and posing in, pretty seductive ways, considering their relatively young age, and amassing lots and lots of followers and living for ticks and likes and probably attracting unwanted attentions, and at the same time being a little bit too naive to really understand the real world effects of that.
Well, the one thing that we can't forget here is that when children are using social networks like an Instagram, like a Facebook, they are children and they are inherently vulnerable as a consequence of that. And we all have an expectation that in the offline world, we will have safe environments for children. So, if your child goes to the playground, that's a fundamentally safe space for them to be. If they go swimming, there will be lifeguards to make sure that they're safe. What we haven't seen on social media, despite the fact that it's such an important part, for better or worse, of children's lives, we know that the majority of children have social media accounts before the age of 13. We haven't seen an attempt to make sure that this is a fundamentally safe space. And where you're talking there about things like likes, design choices that are designed to try and nudge children into posting certain types of content or to spend longer on the site, they are driven by commercial motivations. They are not driven by a primary consideration about if we're doing design choice A or B or C, is that in the best interest of the child? And that's why we need to see the government step in with a really ambitious online safety bill, because unfortunately we've seen time and again that the best that we can hope for from the tech companies themselves is piecemeal action after the event in response to personal tragedies. And that simply isn't good enough when we're talking about children's safety and well-being.
And this is a topic that I cover a lot on this programme, because it strikes me that there's a whole litany of offences being committed on social media. I mean, you can go down the route of these filters that are encouraging people to look artificially unlike themselves. And we've now had to put legislation in place to stop under 18s from having cosmetic surgery. You've had recent reports lately of drugs being pushed online. You've got content showing people how to self-harm or even encouraging people to commit suicide. There's, of course, bullying. There's adult content, which is regularly being put in front of young children. And yet all I ever hear when I say to people, what's the solution to this, is, well, we really need to start by educating our kids at school. But surely that's not enough. I mean, the World Wide Web is plunging children into a very adult world and surely compromising their innocence.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And parents and teachers and professionals, we all have a responsibility, a part to play to help to make sure that children are safe. But that cannot be left to parents, as it has been over the last decade or so, while we see tech firms really failing to live up to their responsibilities and to make sure that platforms are fundamentally safe for children. And, you were talking there about things like content that promotes suicide and self-harm. Let's be really clear about what some of that content does. If you think about the type of influencer style accounts that you will see on Instagram, some of the content that I see in my job is kind of twisted versions of influencer sites that are recommending ways to cause harm to a child through self-harm, through suicide ideation. This is not stuff which is defensible on freedom of expression grounds. It is harmful content. And it's not only that this breaches the terms and conditions of platforms, but the platforms then sit on their hands and don't enforce the rules properly, is that the algorithms will kick in and target vulnerable children. So if you're thinking about, say, a vulnerable teenage girl who once or twice might look at that content, the algorithms kick in. They're not assessing, is this good content or bad content? They're simply assessing that the teenage girl in question is viewing that content. And so perhaps they want to see more of it. And so that's how then you get to a situation where every time a teenager opens up a social media account, there will be more of that content at the top of a timeline. And clearly that is, something which carries really significant risk for our children and young people. And it's because the platforms are not having a set of requirements to make sure that children's safety isn't just an optional extra. It has to be, a legal requirement that if they're serving children, offering products to children, they have to be safe for them.
I mean, it's interesting because I'm doing a special today as part of my broader programme into AI. And for this, I did a lot of research into the developments of AI and the innovations. And I'm left in no doubt, actually, that there are tools that big tech can use to prevent harms taking place and prevent, for instance, young people being approached by far older people, and to put in things such as age verification. Why do you think this is not being done? Why is it? I mean, we've now got Facebook dragged in front of the Parliamentary Select Committee to answer questions, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite to clamp down on social media when we know it causes a huge amount of damage, especially to younger people. What's going on and why aren't people talking out about this?
The simple reality here, Alex, is I think that for a long time, in the absence of this being a legal requirement and in the absence of there being a commercial driver to act to really get on top of the problem, the platforms haven't done enough. They've been able to look at statistics like the grooming data that we're releasing today and to dismiss that as a bad news cycle. And so at best, we see, kind of piecemeal action after the event. We see very targeted action. We haven't seen a comprehensive root and branch focus on prioritising children's safety. Now, it's not because, the companies are evil. It's not that they don't care about children. It's simply that children's safety has not been a core part of the business model. So, Facebook in the last few days have been proclaiming the fact that they've spent $13 billion in the last 4 years on trust and safety. And I don't want to be churlish. That's a significant amount of money, but that's 4% of their turnover during the years that they're giving those figures for, and 4% of turnover to tackle a problem which is becoming increasingly pernicious for children and young people. Never mind the range of other societal harms. So we need to see action which corresponds to the scale of the threat that our children are facing, and we just haven't seen that so far.
Let's have a look at what Facebook have said in response to this. They said this is abhorrent behaviour and we work quickly to find it, remove it and report it to the relevant authorities. We also block adults from messaging under 18s they're not connected with and have introduced technology that makes it harder for potentially suspicious accounts to find young people. Do you buy any of that? Does that sound like enough? Because clearly these things are still taking place regularly.
Well, they have done some of those things, most recently to comply with new UK regulation, which has come in. So, they're taking credit really for something that they have to do to comply with the law. But let's take another example. So Facebook wants to roll out end-to-end encryption of its messaging services. Now that, let's be clear, can have benefits for all of us in terms of privacy. But it also means that if they roll out end-to-end encryption, before there are technical mitigations in place, then at a stroke, 70% of child abuse reports will be lost. That will mean that thousands of children that are safeguarded every year, thousands of child sex offenders that will go to prison because of crimes they're committing on Facebook sites, that will no longer happen. Now, 130 global child protection organisations led by the NSPCC wrote to Mark Zuckerberg 18 months ago, asking him to build those technical mitigations and to commit to only proceeding with this, very high risk design choice once those mitigations were in place and it can be proven that they've worked. Now, 18 months later, we still do not have any set of reassurances from Facebook that they are prepared to do that. So at the flick of a switch, when they have this ready to go, that will mean that we go back to the digital dark ages in terms of child abuse. And what does that say about the priority of Facebook, of children versus wider commercial imperatives. Unfortunately, time and again, if there's a trade-off between children and commercial or adult imperatives, children lose every time, and that can't be right.
I mean, we heard in the news yesterday, Australia actually wants to implement parental consent for minors to access social media. We have forthcoming in the UK something I'm really anticipating, the Online Harms Bill. Do you think that Online Harms Bill could be a seminal moment here to finally turn the tide? And would you want to see something like the policy Australia hopes to introduce put in place here?
So the Online Safety Bill can be a game changer if there's the political will to make sure that this meets the very simple objective that we've laid out for it, that this legislation does everything that is proportionate and reasonable to prevent the type of harm that we're seeing, and harm that is inherently preventable. So we'd really encourage the new Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, to seize this moment, because there's the opportunity with this legislation to protect a generation of children. This can become a crucial part of the child protection landscape that can serve us for decades to come. That is a question really of political will. And when we see the way in which tech firms have failed so often to put children's needs front and centre in their design choices, it's why this now has to be a legal imperative, not, as it is right now, an optional extra as to whether or not we see children being protected.
Andy, thank you so much for coming on today. Very, very important report, so I'm glad you could join us to talk about it. That's Andy Burrows from the NSPCC. Well, keep watching, lots more to come. Hello and welcome. If you've just joined the afternoon agenda, it's just gone 5 o'clock. I'm Alex Phillips, and this show is all about what I think, what you think, and indeed what my guests think. It's not news as you know it, but discussion and debate on things that are, or really should be, on your agenda. Still to come on the afternoon agenda. Animal rights campaigners have targeted a government building to urge politicians to turn to a plant-based future. But is going vegan healthier or greener? Plus, a look ahead to tomorrow's budget. Small businesses in Wales are expected to get a £130 million cash boost from the Chancellor. But is it going to be enough? And it may not be on the agenda of traditional news outlets, but we need to talk about AI. Should we be afraid of artificial intelligence? I'll be hearing from a host of guests, but want to know your thoughts on this fascinating subject too. That's the agenda for the next hour. What's on yours? Email me, gbnews@gbnews.uk, or of course you can tweet me @gbnews. But first, it's time for the news headlines.
Hello, I'm Polly Middlehurst, and these are your headlines at 5 o'clock. Teachers, nurses and police are among the public sector workers in line for a pay rise next year. The Chancellor is going to announce the change for millions of workers in tomorrow's budget. And it comes after Rishi Sunak paused public sector pay increases after heavy borrowing during the pandemic. However, Labour's shadow Child Poverty Minister Wes Streeting criticised the latest budget announcements, including the national minimum wage increase.
The minimum wage increase doesn't go anywhere near far enough to compensating people for those losses. In fact, we calculated that even when you take into account the minimum wage increase, once you've factored in the universal credit cut, once you've factored in the national insurance hike, people end up being still about £800 a year worse off. And by definition, these are people on some of the lowest incomes when they go out to work.
Meanwhile, the Commons Speaker Lindsay Hoyle has criticised the government, saying the number of pre-budget press briefings is unacceptable.
But once again, this House will not be taken for granted. It is not right for everybody to be briefed. It's not more important to go on the news in the morning. It's more important to come here. Let's get this message across. These are the elected members that represents this United Kingdom.
Scotland's First Minister announces double jab travellers to the country will be able to take a lateral flow test on the second day of their trip, aligning with England's rules. Updating MSPs on the latest COVID situation at Holyrood, the First Minister said while the situation has greatly improved since August, it does remain fragile as Scotland heads into the winter period. Ms Sturgeon also said the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow inevitably poses the risk of the virus spreading.
The hosting of COP would always have been a significant challenge given the scale of the event for the UK and Scottish governments and for Glasgow City Council. However, the fact that it is happening amidst a global pandemic obviously makes it even more challenging. And it is inevitably the case that an event of this scale poses a risk of increased COVID transmission.
And the UN has warned the world is on track for climate catastrophe and that the plans to cut emissions still fall far short of what's needed. The organisation's environment programme said even with plans and pledges from countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the next decade, the world still faces global warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. The former Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson faces a 30-day ban from Parliament for breaking lobbying rules. That comes after an investigation by the Parliamentary Committee on Standards into Paterson's lobbying for two companies for whom he was a consultant. The committee says they found an egregious case of paid advocacy. Downing Street has said a motion to suspend Paterson will be moved in the Commons following the usual process. The former Cabinet Minister rejects the findings. Sussex Police say they're investigating 7 cases of women being injected or spiked on nights out. The reports have all come from the Brighton and Eastbourne areas in the last week. Detectives have said they want to reassure members of the public and will increase their patrols in the affected areas. The mother of 2 murdered sisters, Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman, has dismissed an apology from the Metropolitan Police. The force apologised to the family for their initial response to the reports the girls were missing, saying it had come below the standard that should be achieved. The sisters were found dead in a North London park in June last year. Daniel Hussein will be sentenced for their double murder this week. The former Rangers manager, Walter Smith, has died at the age of 73. He led Rangers to 10 wins in top titles, as well as to the UEFA Cup final in 2008. In his career, he also managed the Scottish national team and Everton. The club chairman, Douglas Park, said that Walter will be sorely missed by all of us at Rangers. And the Queen has carried out her first official engagement since her overnight stay in hospital last week. She appeared on a screen via a video link from Windsor Castle, where she's in residence, during a virtual audience with the ambassador from the Republic of Korea. You're up to date. I'm back in half an hour.
Well, welcome back to the afternoon agenda on GB News with me, Alex Phillips. And today, we need to talk about artificial intelligence. Last month, the government published its AI strategy. We're not the first country to do this. In fact, it's a central tenet of the Chinese Communist Party's national programme. Not much was made of this in the media outside of tech magazines, but our push to harness this awesome technology and become a world leader is mega news. It should be headline leading stuff based on the limitless capabilities, application and potential outcomes, both miraculous and disastrous, of a technology understood by so few, which can seriously change so much, with hard to predict and unprecedented outcomes. The late Professor Stephen Hawking, one of the world's most preeminent scientists, warned that efforts to create thinking machines pose a threat to our very existence, saying the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. Yet all too often, AI is either caricatured as either fun robots and harmless technology, or anthropomorphized into the dystopian destruction of humanity by an entity that seizes its own agency to take over the world. Neither are particularly accurate. Putting aside the more whimsical narratives associated with the age of bots, from robo-pets to automaton housemaids, AI advancements are already being used to revolutionize everything from medical research to transport, communications and defense. In fact, almost everything you see, do, touch and buy could soon be made by or powered using artificial intelligence. But while playing God with technology could surely make miracles, it has the capacity to equally plunge us into catastrophes, the likes of which have never before been seen in human history. The reality is that we are creating a technology with boundless capability that is nonetheless bound to human fallibility. What on earth could go wrong? The most exciting innovations to ever be made by man could surely also mean dancing with disaster. Well, joining me now is a lecturer in science and digital technologies at the University of East London, Dr. Mustanza Ali Ghaznfar. Glad to have you on the show. Let's talk about the history of AI a little bit. I mean, it's a rapidly progressing technology, but how long has it been around?
Thank you very much for having me. I would be saying about the history of AI. It started in 90s when you have a small computer programs and you were very excited to hear that, okay, look, something exciting is coming. But in 2000, the technology evolved to the next era where we have a lot of data, the new computer, the Windows came, and then new operating system came. And in 2010, we have more and more programs. But I would say it's there for last 3 decades. So it started in 1990s, but now we are at the top of AI in 2020.
And where on earth does this technology go? Because it's applicable to so many fields. I mean, I didn't realise in doing my research, I kind of thought of it more as, you know, when you swipe up on your phone and it uses facial recognition technology. But it can start to predict things like, you know, certain diseases and create antidotes for certain diseases by using complex technologies and calculating systems to render the perfect medicine. It's phenomenal. I mean, is there a limit to what we can do? Should there be a limit to what we can do?
I would personally think there is no limit. So this is just a start. So when you talk about AI, the spectrum of applications they can cover, this is huge, right from the robotics to the healthcare, to you have seen the self-driving cars. In finance, you can see the recent blockchain technology, which is inspired by AI. Then you have the retails, and there's a lot more applications which would be going in future. So there is no limit. And to me, a lot of reports they would be coming in the market. Like I can see in the screen, this is a report by the Boston group, and you can see they can walk. And in fact, if you think they can pretty much imitate any human move, and you might be wondering how we train them. You know, when a child, he wants to ride a bicycle and he don't know what to do. So their mother or the father, they told them, hey, when the bike is coming on the left, just shift your way to the right. If the bike is going on the right, shift your way to the left. And then how they learn to ride the bike. Similarly, we teach robots, hey, you want to jump, so this is the move you have to do. If you're going to fall on the left, shift your way to the right. So this is just like how child works. So robots for AI, they are just children, and we train them using the softwares, and they learn very fast like children's.
I mean, certainly those fog-like bots we just saw on the screen there look pretty cool and relatively harmless. But surely the problem when you're talking about things like artificial intelligence and human intelligence is that the human has to be able to predict and limit what this sort of boundless technology can do. Otherwise, it can, you know, sort of move along in all sorts of different directions and create catastrophes. Should we be afraid at the speed at which AI is developing when there isn't really any sort of global concord in place for how we do manage it, and we're yet to see any big AI-related disasters, but surely they're in train?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. When we talk about the ethical issues about AI, like in robotics, I was reading the other day the same reports which you are showing in the screen. They are going to be commercialized in a couple of years. So I can buy any report in $50,000. And you know, I can ask them to walk and so on. This is somehow scary as well. If there's some fault in the report. So definitely on the ethical side, we need some regulations that if we want to commercialize them, what are the license for that? And government should take some actions for not commercializing such things like the reports. Apart from that, they will be pretty good, like self-driving cars. I think if we can have 33 million self-driving car by 2040, which is an estimation by Tesla and all those major companies, they can change the life. So they can make our journey extremely easier. So there is a plus side as well. But I agree, at the same time, there need to be some regulation in the framework. And still, today, there are no regulations. And I would definitely think UK government, they need to have regulation around these notions before we are going to commercialize that. And one more example I want to give about the retail industry. You can see recently Amazon opened an office in London where you can go, you don't have any cashier. You simply go pick your stuff and simply walk away. So this is pretty cool. But to commercialize such thing, you definitely need to have some regulations which are not there in place right now.
Pretty cool for some, pretty creepy for others, I can tell you. Dr. Mustanza Ali Ghazanfar there, who's a lecturer in science and digital technologies at the University of East London. Well, joining me now is freelance technology journalist Lee Bell. Lee, AI, should we be afraid? I mean, this is very exciting technology, moving at such a rapid speed, and I'm in no doubt that it can enable human beings to do things we never dreamt of before. But surely some of those things are bad things as well as good things.
Yeah, I think it doesn't get a bad rep, probably due to how it's been portrayed in sort of headlines and Hollywood films in the past. It's always seen as a negative, scary thing, but it's not something I think we need to fear. I mean, there's a sentiment that this is scary technology, and I think it's quite an irrational thing. It's going to become more prominent as time goes on, and it's going to help things around us become smarter. But it's not something that we need to be scared of. I think those scary narratives that we see on Hollywood blockbusters, I think they're sort of fantasy, and it is it's something that we use every day around us all the time. I mean, even our smartphones, to unlock them, we use facial recognition technology, and this uses AI. That's something that nearly everyone uses all the time. So to see it as a really scary thing, I don't think it's necessary.
But then, you say that, without doubt, AI is ubiquitous, but there are so few people out there who really understand it and have the power to harness it. And that alone surely creates a conundrum that, whatever you can program a computer to do, however fast its processing speed, it's still connected to human decision-making and indeed human fallibility. So, I mean, what are the risks you foresee that could be attached to AI? Because there must be some.
Yeah, I mean, there are risks like with anything, with any technology, and it is a powerful technology. So, people should, they have they should be scared, not scared, but I can understand why they would feel scared at it, because it is daunting. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about how it's going to take our jobs, but again, this is a lot down to sort of fear-mongering. But I think it's something like that. It's not something that will happen overnight. It's something that will be implemented gradually over time. As innovations and technology develops, I think it will give people in their roles and their jobs the ability to sort of use AI to their advantage, so they can sort of retrain other things, and AI can take advantage of the things that they don't really like doing, like the repetitive, boring, tedious tasks of work that computers can handle, and you can then get along with your job doing more creative things, more decision making important things. But I think, like you say, of course it can be used for bad, like with anything, and they're as with all technologies, they're evolving and they can become more dangerous. I mean, it could be used in cyber warfare, with bots generating fake news. So we've seen in several political campaigns over the last few years, namely the Cambridge Analytica scandal. I mean, that used AI technology. But like with any technology, it can be used for bad, but it's not necessarily to do with the technology always. It's not the one to blame. It's perhaps the people behind it, and if they weren't using AI, they're probably using something else to cause harm. So I think after some of the scandals we've seen in the last few years, we are becoming more aware of its potential to be used for bad, and there definitely is more regulation needed to keep it from being used to the detriment of society. But I think generally it's doing more good for the majority than it is bad.
Oh, Lee, well, call me a Luddite or a troglodyte, but it does frighten me a little bit. I'm glad you're more optimistic. And saying that, you know more than me. Lee Bell, who's a freelance technology journalist, giving us the lowdown on what's happening in the world of AI. Well, joining me now is the Senior Vice President at multinational computer technology company Oracle, Yvette Cameron. Yvette, tell me, what's sort of going on in the world of AI at the moment? What's Oracle developing, and what sort of things are in train that we can expect to see in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for having me on today. So at Oracle, we're investing in AI to make it pervasive across the capabilities and the functionality that we deliver. And it's interesting from the conversation I just heard, the concern about AI, but we're actually finding a growing demand for AI. In fact, we just recently completed a survey about AI at work. This is our fourth in an annual survey where we're studying the interactions between individuals and technology at work. And with the pandemic and everybody feeling very disconnected and not very motivated about work and really struggling financially and with mental health, we found that 82% or 77% of individuals across the UK specifically are specifically looking for technology to help them drive their future. And in this case, artificial intelligence is exactly the kind of technology that they're looking for. Technology that's going to help them recommend ways to learn new skills, to identify the skills that they need to grow their careers, ways to identify new career paths that traditional processes and human interaction wouldn't necessarily identify. With artificial intelligence, we're able to embed an understanding of skills and adjacencies so that the robotics within the application can make these recommendations that are really unique and insightful for individuals. And that's just a small example. We're looking at AI across the entire release of capabilities that we have across Oracle and finding new ways to bring value to individuals.
Yeah, it strikes me that sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning could be applied in almost any sector and replace almost any job. But, I mean, is there not a risk that that isn't a desirable thing to do?
Well, certainly we do want to use artificial intelligence, not just to replace jobs, but to augment people in their work, to make work more palatable. We want to remove the friction. We want to remove the things that people don't want to do in their jobs, right? So robotic process automation and an early stage of artificial intelligence. Let's take the drudgery out of our work. Let's have that administrative work and those automated processes removed from our jobs so that we can focus in new areas. Now, it's true that AI is coming in and enhancing and replacing some of the work that we've done, like drivers, for example, in the lorries, right? Their jobs oftentimes are now being disrupted as automated artificial intelligence is being used to drive those cars and trucks. But then what happens for those displaced drivers? They have an opportunity to upskill and find entirely new types of work, drone operators, operating and operating the AI, designing the AI, but in everyday work as well. As artificial intelligence is taking over bits and pieces of our work, new opportunities are opening up for us as individuals. And in fact, if you look at the studies, there are many studies by many different organizations that show the number of jobs actually created by the advent of artificial intelligence is actually greater than the number of jobs that are going to be lost to artificial intelligence.
I mean, it's understood there's a bit of an arms race going on right now between your country, America, and China when it comes to developing AI technology because of the huge economic impact and the influence that a country can have if it really manages to wield this technology to the furthest of its potential, pushing boundaries. But is that quite a scary prospect? Do you think that at some point there needs to be some sort of global concord about how this technology is used and to make sure it's always used for good?
You know, that's a nice thought that there could be one global organization who's driving the ethics behind AI. But I think the reality is, as AI and evolves and as adoption increases across the many, many different ways AI is used, the consumers and the legislative bodies in different areas will start to get involved. I mean, ethical AI, I know at Oracle, we ask ourselves a series of questions before we invest. We're asking, how are we going to measure the impact of this artificial intelligence investment, the value to the business? How are we going to protect the privacy of individuals? How do we watch for unexpected consequences? And where is that human intervention in the AI that's going to help prevent those kind of negative consequences? I do indeed believe that legislation and regulations will come, but we can't hamper the creativity and the drive from consumers as we're looking at, you know, the capabilities of AI in the consumer world, and we bring that into our work lives at our employers. We don't want to hamper innovation with legislation, but at the same time, we need to be mindful of that. And so as we're investing and adopting artificial intelligence, we need to be asking those providers of the technology, how are you ensuring the ethics? How are you ensuring the outcomes of your AI are not doing bad things for society?
Yvette, it reassures me at least that Oracle is putting the ethics before the development. I'm not sure all actors will be doing that, particularly those in other countries, but fascinating to hear from you today. That's Yvette Cameron, who's a senior vice president at Oracle. It does strike me, that, when we look at what's going on with Facebook, .com technology developed, didn't it? And now we're potentially trying to retrospectively regulate it, and it's all getting a bit messy. So, yeah, AI, certainly a sector to keep your eye on. After the break, animal rights campaigners have targeted a government building, urging politicians to turn to a plant-based future. But is being vegan healthier or greener? Let's find out after this break. Welcome back. Animal rights activists have scaled a government building in Westminster, urging world leaders to invest in a plant-based future. 4 protesters from Animal Rebellion, yeah, that's right, an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion no less, climbed the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. They began protesting at 6 a.m. and say they plan to stay there indefinitely. James, on the side of the building, told GB News the government's priorities are wrong.
the UK government is being a public nuisance by spending £1.5 billion of taxpayer money on subsidies for the meat and dairy industry. That's an industry that is ultimately killing the planet and killing billions of animals. In the meantime, it's spending 150 million, that's 10% of that, on planting trees and similarly on alternative proteins. It goes to show like the government's priorities in terms of propping up unsustainable and unprofitable industries over what's ultimately better for the public and the planet.
So those environmental campaigners want us to move towards a vegan diet. Notice how they don't say vegan anymore, do they? It's plant-based. But is it more healthy and environmentally friendly? I'm joined by Rhiannon Lambert, who's a nutritionist. Rhiannon, thank you for coming on today. First of all, let's analyse the sort of vegan diet, so to speak. My concern here is, while, you know, a very traditional plant-based vegan diet certainly does have lots of health benefits, for a lot of people, it's hard to make food you want to eat in your kitchen based on a vegan diet, and so they end up resorting to ultra-processed foods.
So I think there's a bit of a miscommunication here on the two definitions that you've quite rightly said at the start, plant-based and veganism. Veganism does not mean plant-based. So plant-based simply means reducing animal consumption. So the stats we have globally are that if we were to reduce our animal consumption, so that just means half the amount you would normally eat, or just perhaps have more meat-free days during the week, we could reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. That is the stat. So we do know that this would be really good for the environment. But when it comes to veganism, that means omitting all animal products completely, which is not what the research is saying for plant-based diets. So they are two completely separate things, but it is possible to cook. Actually, you could save a lot of money cooking a vegan diet alongside, I'm going to use the word plant-based for this feature because I think it's more appropriate, but you can save a lot of pennies from reducing your meat consumption in general and switching for things like beans and pulses and legumes, and it can taste delicious too.
But is there not a risk here that, you know, cynical big food companies have seized upon this latest trend to make all sorts of things from, you know, vegan chicken katsu curries to, you know, vegan sausage rolls, so on and so forth? And at the end of the day, these food products are probably still using things like palm oil, which is causing huge amounts of devastation to natural habitat. They're laden with salts and sugars to make them taste palatable. And they're coming out of factories, chugging out super high emissions. Do you think that actually, if people are going to follow the plant-based diet, that they need to be quite mindful of how they do it?
I think in general, the population could do with cooking from scratch more. We live in a very convenience-based society, and I do agree that you can equally be a very unhealthy plant-based eater. You could also be vegan and just eat chips and vegan burgers all day long, and that's very high in salt, and it can also be very damaging for your heart health and long-term health. So ultimately, the answer is cooking from scratch, but we have to be realistic. And how can we get consumers to make a step in the right direction? So in my nutrition clinic, I'm often thinking with my clients, how can I get these changes in? How can we move away from these convenience items? Things like veggie sausages are actually quite a good option for people to switch from pork. And yes, they may be high in salt, but some of them aren't. And manufacturers, I think, are trying to reformulate these to get these lower in salt. But as you quite rightly said, the answer in my eyes is definitely cooking delicious meals from scratch. What happened to traditional family favourites?
I couldn't agree more. As you may have noticed, I've broken my hand and I spent all of Sunday making lots of soups to eat for the rest of the bloody month. Oh, didn't say that Ofcom, sorry. But, you know, if people are thinking I want to change, I can hear the gallery laughing in my ear now. If people are thinking I want to change the way that I go about looking after my health and also looking after the environment, what would you recommend they do? At the moment, there's proponents of this sort of so-called 5-2 diet where people only eat meat perhaps at the weekends. Is that a sort of good initial approach to make sure you're still getting the right sort of nutrients and vitamins in your body as you start to experiment with what you can do at home?
Absolutely. Slow and steady changes. A meat-free Monday is great. Or as people have said, just have meat at the weekends as a kind of treat. And that's a really good way of ensuring you're still getting your iron, iodine, essential nutrients that are a little bit more tricky to get on a plant-based diet if you're not educated on what to look for. Then there's the other aspect, I think, as well, that you mentioned there, of things like how can you get your head around these changes? They may seem so big, but actually just reducing meat to 50 grams a day instead of 108 means your carbon footprint can make a difference by up to 20%. If you cut meat altogether, up to 40%. So it really will help impact the environment if you can just make small changes. Nobody's saying if you are a meat or dairy lover, you have to give it up overnight. They do have their place, especially in some cultures around the world. We just are asking simply not to have it every single day at every single meal.
Rhiannon, thank you so much for coming on and demystifying some of the things about plant-based diet, and actually interesting that distinction between veganism and plant-based diets as well. And apologies to any viewers for my rather sanguine, low-level, inappropriate word just then. I've got a throbbing thumb. I'm just going to blame it on that. Still to come on the afternoon agenda, it's time to hear what you think about AI. I've been asking if we should be afraid of artificial intelligence. Well, we're going to hear your views on this, but first it's time for the news headlines.
Hello, and here are your GB News headlines at 5:30. Teachers, nurses and police are just some of the public sector workers in line for a pay rise next year. The Chancellor is due to announce the change for millions of workers in tomorrow's budget. That comes after Rishi Sunak paused public sector pay increases after heavy borrowing during the pandemic.
But once again, this House will not be taken for granted. It is not right for everybody to be briefed. It's not more important to go on the news in the morning. It's more important to come here. Let's get this message across. These are the elected members that represents this United Kingdom.
Sussex police say they're investigating 7 cases of women being injected or spiked during nights out. The reports have all come from Brighton and Eastbourne in the last week. Detectives are saying they want to reassure members of the public and will increase their patrols in the affected areas. The UN's been warning the world is on track for climate catastrophe and that plans to cut emissions still fall far short of what's needed. The organisation's environment programme said even with plans and pledges from countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the next decade, the world faces global warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. Scotland's First Minister announces double jab travellers to the country will be able to take a lateral flow test on the second day of their trip. The change will align Scotland's travel testing rules with those in England. Updating MSPs on the latest COVID situation at Holyrood, the First Minister said while the situation has greatly improved since August, it does remain fragile as Scotland heads into the winter period. And the Queen has carried out her first official engagement a week after her overnight stay in hospital. She appeared on a screen via a video link from Windsor Castle, where she's in residence, during a virtual audience with the ambassador from the Republic of Korea. Good news for Her Majesty. I'm back with a full news update at the top of the hour. See you then.
Well, that's not me, is it? That's a chair. Here I am. The Chancellor is expected to announce a new £130 million fund to help thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises in Wales in tomorrow's budget. The fund will be delivered through the British Business Bank and will help Welsh firms to invest and grow. Our Wales reporter Lily Hewitson has the latest on how essential this boost is for small entrepreneurs in the region.
Good morning. Yes, more money is always good news for small businesses here in Wales. In 2019, they actually accounted for 62.4% of employment here. And as the Chancellor is expected to announce that new fund of £130 million at tomorrow's spending review, the possibility of this money is being welcomed by the Welsh Conservatives. I'm joined now by James Evans, the member of the Senedd for Brecon and Radnorshire. Thank you for joining us on the Great British Breakfast, James. Firstly, I just want to ask, what difference is this money going to make for small businesses here in Wales if it is announced?
If this funding is to be announced, Lily, this is going to have a huge impact for businesses right across Wales, from North Wales, Mid Wales, East Wales and West Wales, because what we've seen is Welsh Government investment has always been targeted in the South Wales, in Cardiff, Newport and Swansea. Parts of the valleys in Blaen y Gwent, for example, have been neglected, especially my constituency of Brecon and Radnorshire, Montgomeryshire. So it's really going to help businesses right across the country as part of the UK government's levelling up agenda, giving businesses that opportunity. As we've seen, this fund across the UK has been helped, it's created high-skilled jobs, it's increased productivity and it's upskilled the workforce. This is really, really important. And this fund, which has been similar in England, has provided loans and also help with investment in start-up businesses. And our small businesses are the backbone of our economy here in Wales, and they need to be protected. And I'm so pleased that this funding, if it is announced, is going to be coming to Wales to protect our small and medium-sized businesses.
Now, there were some figures floating around yesterday from the Welsh Liberal Democrats that I just want to mention. They claim that Wales received less post-Brexit support for small businesses than any other UK nation. England received £7.2 million, whereas Wales received just £230,000. Is this money that might be announced tomorrow just kind of making up for that big discrepancy in funds there, or is it actually something completely different?
Well, no, what we've seen, Lee, over the years is that the Welsh Labour government here in Wales have not invested properly right across the country. As I've said, they've invested in certain parts of Wales, that's in South Wales, which, ironically, for the last 5 years, they've been supported by the Liberal Democrats in power, which hasn't levelled up Wales, which has neglected small businesses across the country. The UK government during coronavirus invested heavily in Wales. It supported 460,000 jobs. It helped 173,000 self-employed people right across Wales. The UK government cares about Wales. It wants to level up our country and make sure that we can be as productive as possible, to make sure that we're enhancing ourselves on a global stage and being part of the United Kingdom and not part of this separatist agenda, which is being driven by Welsh Labour.
But those figures there is quite a big difference. So the amount of money that was given to small businesses in England is 7.2 million, whereas Wales was just 230,000. That is quite a huge difference, though. So surely this money is kind of making up that difference.
I don't think that's right. As I said, the UK government is heavily invested. It's up to the Welsh government where they spend their money. And I think more information needs to come out from them is actually where they put a lot of their grant funding over the years. And as I said, that has always been in South Wales. I know businesses in my part of the world which have been told to relocate into South Wales and leave parts of Mid Wales because they'd be able to access grant funding. I don't think that's fair. And I think the UK government doing as much as they can now to invest in Wales to make sure, I said, that we've got that level playing field right across the UK, and this money is going to help all our small and medium-sized businesses right across Wales to increase our productivity, to create highly skilled jobs and make Wales an attractive place for people to come, live and work, because that's what I think is very important. It helps build our local economies and our smaller economies here in Wales and actually help boost jobs, as I've said earlier, which helps fund our vital public services which we all rely on.
Well, thank you for joining us on the Great British Breakfast this morning. And that was James Evans, the member of the Senedd for Brecon and Radnorshire. So we will have to see in that budget tomorrow whether there will be that funding there for small businesses here in Wales. But it sounds like it may well be the case.
That was Lily Hewitson there, our wonderful Welsh correspondent. Now, lots of us love taking selfies or pictures to brag about our lives on social media, and we store oodles of them in the cloud. In fact, Brits take almost 900 photos a year, with dozens of duplicates also kept on our phones. But research published today reveals that in total, these media memories rack up the same carbon emissions as 112,000 flights from London to Perth. The study by the Institute of Engineering and Technology identifies other habits which aren't environmentally friendly, like having multiple mobile phones or texting and watching Netflix at the same time. Is it about time we spoke about the emissions created by banks of servers and our insatiable appetite for the latest device? Well, joining me now is Malcolm Grimston, a Senior Research Fellow at the Imperial College Centre for Energy Policy and Technology. Malcolm, when I stumbled across this report today, it fascinated me because all too often when we think carbon emissions, we think cars and aeroplanes and, farting cows. But truly speaking, there must be a hell of a lot of emissions coming out of things such as, all the various servers storing our data, and in the creation of mobile phones we change every couple of years.
Yes, you're right. So you've been talking about artificial intelligence today. There's quite a carbon footprint and energy requirement, particularly when the AI units are learning a new task. We're getting used to the concept of Bitcoin and other virtual currency. They have an enormous carbon footprint, and as the recent report shows, each of us is contributing towards that when we're not deleting stuff that we're never going to need again from our phones. I'm a moderately good deleter, I have to say, but I'm aware that I could be doing an awful lot more. Because when you think about it, if you've just got I'm old enough to remember when our photographs came in an album and we sat around looking at them. You don't need much energy to store that, but now you need something to maintain the electronics that make these pictures and retain these pictures, and you need quite a lot of energy to get at them if they're stored on the cloud.
So is this basically, if you slim down the content on your mobile phone or the stuff you keep on the cloud, then in fact you're sort of speeding up the functionality of your device. You're making it operate quicker and therefore you don't need to charge it as much. Is that the sort of sequence of events that leads to that result?
That is a factor, but the other factor is that when you have a photograph stored in the cloud has to constantly put energy in to keep that photograph in existence, because it only exists in the circuits of the central cloud server. It doesn't exist on paper as it used to do in the old days. Goodness me, I remember these days, and they weren't all that long ago. Where, of course, if you've got a piece of paper in a drawer, you don't need to maintain it because it's on paper, it's maintaining itself. And similarly, to get at anything that's on the cloud, we need to access the cloud. That involves energy. It's really, I still find it quite mind-boggling when we think of the amount of energy that's flowing all around it, because, say, when we're using the internet, we can immediately on our phones get in touch with literally billions of bits of information. That takes an enormous amount of energy. So it's not just a matter of us not of when we're actively using these things that we don't need. They do need maintenance when we're not actually using them at all.
It's funny because this is something we don't really talk about a lot when we're discussing things like, don't leave your lights on if you don't need to. Certainly don't put your heating on if it's not necessary, especially with rising gas prices. A lot of activism is done online, and yet we never talk about actually the environmental impact that .com has, or manufacturers of mobile phones. Do you think it's about time we actually started having a conversation about that so people could learn to be perhaps just a little bit more pragmatic and frugal about their usage?
Yes, I certainly do think that. And to be fair, this report, which has just been published, is aiming to do precisely that, to get this more into the public realm, because it's a relatively cost-free issue. Just emptying our phones of half of the photograph, the ones that we're never going to look at again, maybe that we just took in a street because we saw something vaguely interesting and we're no longer vaguely interested in it. It's not a big imposition on us, but the energy savings can be really quite significant. And in our, roughly speaking, if we use a gigabyte of data, that has a carbon footprint about the same as driving a mile. It's not the end of the world, but it's a significant amount when you add it all up, given the amount of data that we use today particularly on our mobile phones. So I think this undoubtedly is one of the areas where, because electronics and the web and the cloud is so much more part of our lives now than it was even going back 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, it is certainly time that we started looking very seriously at the implications of this and looking at ways that we can reduce that footprint. This is one of those areas where I think we can do that without a great deal of detriment to our day-to-day life.
Malcolm, I'm really glad you tried to sort of metricate this calculation and said that sort of 1 gigabyte of data is equivalent to driving 1 mile. I understand what driving a mile is, but little old me has no idea what a gigabyte of data is. So what is that equivalent to?
Gosh, off the top of my head, I have a 3 gigabyte program on my mobile phone. And I guess it gives me about I don't want to be quoted on this particularly, but I guess it gives me about 10 hours of live streaming to the cloud. It might be something slightly different from that, but that's the sort of ballpark. So from time to time, I do need to top it up because I do enjoy watching streaming things when I'm out and about. So that's the sort of ballpark we're talking about. My figures will undoubtedly be wrong to an extent, but I think that's broadly speaking the sort of ballpark that we're talking about.
Do you think we live now in a dangerously disposable society? I mean, I'm going to sound really old-fashioned now, but back in the day, you bought things and you kept them for life, and you had make, do, and mend. And if your vacuum cleaner broke down, you took it to the repair shop. Whereas now, we're used to updating our phones automatically every 2 years and are prompted to do so. And I'm quite suspicious that the technology is almost designed to force us down that route. Do you think that this is something we should be talking about, considering we're coming up to the big climate change summit this month?
Yes, indeed. I mean, this is another aspect of the whole thing. Phones actually contain quite a lot of very nasty chemicals that require quite a large mining industry and very significant environmental damage just to make them. They require batteries, they require the circuitry and the like. And as you rightly say, my make, do, and mend mentality of the war years, and indeed, right the way through my childhood, my parents were very good at making things work. And there are countries around the world that keep things going year on year, but there has been an increasing tendency to throw things away, be they are when anything comes to the end of its life or before the end of its life is thrown away. And I do think the idea of what they talk about a closed economy, that instead of an economy which is creating waste, we move towards one where any waste that is produced gets recycled or reused. There's a hierarchy on waste. The best thing to do is not to produce it in the first place. The second is to reuse it. And of course, in these days of plastic bottles compared to the glass bottles that I used to get a penny or tuppence back on when I was a kid, we throw away a frightening amount of material now in plastic packaging, which I think is something which is now in the public mind. And then the third one is either recycling or using the material for energy. Those are all better than landfill. But the best of all is just not producing the waste in the first place or reusing the material once we've used it. And I think there's enormous debate there about how we move away from this assumption that just when something breaks down, it's cheaper and quicker to get another one. And to be honest, it is cheaper and quicker to get another one very often.
Yeah, Malcolm, I can certainly think of a lot of people who reuse their selfies from 10 years ago, that's for sure. Malcolm Grimston, fascinating conversation there. Malcolm is, of course, from the Imperial College Centre for Energy Policy and Technology, on a subject I think we might end up talking a lot more about. Well, today on the afternoon agenda, we've been talking about, should we be afraid of artificial intelligence? I spoke to former senior military intelligence officer, fascinating interview, Philip Ingram, MBE. I asked him if we need to be cautious of the future military applications of artificial intelligence.
No, we have to be extremely worried, especially about China's advancement in anything to do with the development of technology. We look at the way that China's been using its facial recognition technology combined with machine learning to identify members of the Uyghur population so that they can then put them into their what they euphemistically call retraining camps. That is where we can see these tools being used for bad effect.
I was also joined by lecturer of science and digital technologies from the University of East London, Dr. Ghazanfar. He told us how huge the potential of AI really is.
I would personally think there is no limit. So this is just a start. So when you talk about AI, the spectrum of applications they can cover, this is huge, right from the robotics to the healthcare to you have seen the self-driving cars. In finance, you can see the recent blockchain technology, which is inspired by AI. Then you have the retails, and there's a lot more applications which would be going in future. So there is no limit. And to me, a lot of reports they would be coming in the market. Like I can see in the screen, this is a report by the Boston group, and you can see they can walk. And in fact, if you think they can pretty much imitate any human move.
Not sure I want that little monster jumping down my street. I don't know about you. Well, we have been getting lots of emails from you coming in on this subject, and what a fascinating subject it is indeed. So now it's time for you, the viewer, to have the final word. Tom says, yes, have you not seen Terminator or iRobot or any other film that depicts them trying to wipe us out? That'll be next. Hope not. Karen says, I'm just glad I'm almost 60. The world reminds me of that Kurt Russell film of the 80s, Escape from New York, a film full of self-driving, robot-driving monocars, half-human weirdos, where the population lives mostly underground. The film was a fantasy, fast becoming a reality. Daniel says, no, AI can be a good thing. We should be terrified of how it'll be used by governments, tech giants, etc. against us. Well, we've been running our Twitter poll and asking you at home, should we be afraid of AI? You've said 68% yes, we should be afraid. You've been watching The Afternoon Agenda with me, Alex Phillips. Join me again tomorrow from 4 p.m. Coming up next, it's Michelle Dewberry, but first, here's the weather.
Hello, an unsettled few days ahead across the UK. Some heavy rain to come over the next couple of days. Windy for all of us, but it is staying pretty mild out there. Let's take a look at the